Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a webinar, Breaking Down the Silos. My name is Sharon Dittmar, and I'm a congregational life consultant for the Mid-America region of congregations in the UUA. Our region includes 13 states, and I was talking to some of the folks on this webinar who've signed up, and we have a wide swath of our region represented, which is really fun. So I want to say, first of all, a thank you to all of you. It is actually the money that you give through the annual program fund and to the region that makes this webinar free and possible. So we're very grateful for your donations and for you living into covenant with our UU brethren, all of us, our siblings in faith. And now I want to introduce you to two people who will be leading this webinar. But actually, I think before I do that, I should just run through a few Zoom basics. The first is I'm going to be muting everyone who comes on because we have up to 60 people signed up. So the way we're going to be communicating is a little chat box at the bottom. If you're not familiar with Zoom, you go down to the bottom of your screen, the middle, and you just hover your mouse over it, and there's like a little white bubble that comes up, and it says chat. And if you click that, you can chat to someone individually. You could chat to the whole group. So if I pull up, I can pull up everyone, and if I click to a little down button cursor to the right, I can find anyone individually to communicate with. So like if you see an old friend, you could like say, hi, nice to see you on the webinar. Ashley and Danny have informed me that this webinar is almost entirely slides and explanation and sharing information and presentation. There will be very brief time for questions at the end, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. However, this is a multi-pack series. I think we have 6 of them. And the second one, the next one, you get a lot of time to converse and ask questions. So this is really the information one. The slides will go online. They'll all be put up in a few days, as will the recording for this webinar, all right? I will be monitoring the chat box. Ashley also let me know she can't handle tonight big questions on like, well, if we have this situation at church, what should we do? But she can't handle questions like, you used a word I don't know what you're meaning by systematic white supremacy. I don't know what you mean by triangulation, whatever. She's happy to define that. So I will keep an eye on the chat box for those sorts of questions. And if you want to just converse with me, you can be like, hey, Sharon, does this question count? You can also find me. I'm under Mid-America. This is me right here. All right, everyone, without further ado, I turn you over to our 2 presenters who are just lovely and wonderful. We have tonight, drum roll, we have Reverend Ashley Horan. Ashley, can you wave? There she is. And we have Pastor Danny Gibbons. There you are, Danny. So now they're going to take it away.
Cool. And Sharon, I'm going to put you on the spot and also say that if there are questions that you would like us to answer in part 2 of this webinar, you can either email them directly to us. We'll give you our email address at the end of the session, or you can give Sharon a little extra work and send them to her in the chat box, and she will collect them and pass them on to us at the end of the webinar. So don't feel like you have to hold them forever. So hi, everybody. We're so honored to be doing this partnership with Mid-America region. We know that the Love Resists campaign of the UUA has also sent out links to this, so we know there might be folks from even outside of the Mid-America region who are watching this. So we're really excited. We deeply believe in collaborative partnership at Moose Jaw, the Minnesota Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Alliance, and feel like we are all stronger when we work together. So we're going to start out just by giving you a little bit of context about ourselves, Danny and I, and letting you know we've posed ourselves 2 questions as introduction. The first is, what life stories brought us to do the work that we're currently doing? And why do we care that UUs do more effective work for justice? So Danny, I'm going to turn it over to you to answer those questions first, and then I'll tell folks a little bit about myself.
Hey, everybody out there. I'm glad and honored to be on this webinar today. Just starting out, what life stories brought me to this work that I'm currently doing? There's a myriad of things, but I'll just keep it really brief and short. I served about 12 years in prison for shooting an off-duty police officer during a robbery, and I myself was shot during that process. And it was during the 12-year incarceration period that I went through this period of self-discovery and arrived at this plateau where I really wanted to find a way to impact change and add value and life and meaning to my life, and to come back into my community to do it in real ways. And so when I came home from prison in 2008, I started my church above every name in 2011. And I honestly thought starting the church was going to be like, this was going to be the thing. Like, this was going to be really it. And I found myself in the pulpit preaching, excited, church growing, all that good stuff. But it didn't really kind of bring that thing home that really like said, yeah, this is where I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to do. And I know this is among the many things that I do, but it was through an opportunity to come in and do some intersectional work with First Universalist Unitarian Church of Minneapolis, who was hosting a vigil at that time. It was following the wake of the shooting of Mike Brown in Ferguson and the non-indictment of Officer Darren Wilson. And BLM Minneapolis had hosted an action in partnership with some other organizations here. And folks were feeling like, yo, we want to do something more like a vigil, a place to kind of come and unpack this. We don't necessarily feel called to the front line or shutting down highways. And I was invited to come in as a clergy of color to pray. It was there that I met Lena Gardner, who was an activist with BLM Minneapolis, and she invited me to this space and place to join BLM Minneapolis. And so it was through that work of doing congregational, racially rooted justice work that really woke it up for me. And why do I care that UUs do this work more effectively? I had an opportunity to do some work with Standing on the Side of Love down in North Carolina with the Moral Monday movement that was happening back then, and to see the not only just presence and power of our UU community there, but it also demonstrated to me that what this would look like if we drew the circle wider and we actually put action to our morals and values. And so that's kind of coloring the lines for me.
Great. Thank you, Danny. Pastor Danny, I don't think said at the beginning of his introduction, but he is our new statewide organizer for Moose Jaw. It's a new position that was created with a generous grant from the UU Service Committee that was matched by 4 congregations here in the Twin Cities. And so he's working with our congregations around the state of Minnesota and beyond. And I'm Ashley Horan. I'm the executive director of Moose Jaw. I'm a lifelong Unitarian Universalist, or since I was a very young child. Grew up at Unity Church Unitarian in St. Paul, and then went off to do a whole lot of other things for a while. Eventually went to seminary at Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago, and ended up serving a couple of our small congregations for a few years after that, the Universalist Unitarian Church of Joliet in Illinois, and then I served them for 2 years and 1 year as the consulting minister at the Open Circle UU Fellowship in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. At that point, this was 2014, my family wanted to make a move back to the Twin Cities, which is where I had grown up, and this executive director position job was open. And I thought, okay, cool, this is going to be great. I've always been passionate about justice, but I don't think this is going to be a lifelong ministry track career for me. But I thought, what a great way to get back to the Twin Cities. My partner had a job, so I took the job and was excited about it. I started in July of 2014, and about 3 weeks after I came into the job, Michael Brown was killed. And that, as we all know, was a real catalyst moment across the nation, but also here in the Twin Cities. It was really kind of the beginning of the formation of the Black Lives Matter chapter here that Danny referenced being a part of. And of course, working in justice ministry meant that the job that I was coming into was very different than the one that I thought I was taking. And so the question was whether I and the organization that I served were going to rise to meet the moment and become what the world needed of us, or if we're going to kind of do business as usual. So there's some pretty radical changes that happened. We shifted our organizing model away from individual issue-based working groups toward doing convening and capacity building, working with Unitarian Universalist congregations. There are 26 here in Minnesota, as well as with secular and interfaith organizations doing movement building here in the Twin Cities and throughout Minnesota. So I care really deeply that you are able to show up in accountable ways. I want us to be useful. I want us to be skilled. I want us to be deeply theologically grounded, because I think it matters that not only that we show up as people of faith, but that we show up as Unitarian Universalists. And most of us really struggle in speaking about why it is that we care about the Black Lives Matter movement, or the water protectors, or environmental justice, or any number of other things as Unitarian Universalists. So that's why we're bringing you this webinar tonight and the series that will follow. We're so glad you could join us. And we're going to jump right in here to the content. So tonight is part one of a two-part webinar. And as Sharon mentioned earlier, tonight we're really going to be presenting a lot of content. And then in part two of this webinar, at the end of this one, we're going to assign you some homework. I don't know if you knew that was what you were getting into, but we're going to actually ask you for some feedback and questions and observations from your congregations that will help us shape the conversation in part two, which is going to be much more of a dialogue. So tonight we're going to be presenting a number of different things, but we're really starting from the place of, one of the most common concerns that we hear from the congregations that we're working with is that they've got the racial justice group, environmental justice group, and then folks who are serving at the meals at the homeless shelter, and the folks who are working on keeping the pipeline from going through, but that folks are not actually talking to each other across issues, that actually instead folks are competing for resources, that they're feeling like the congregation's attention is divided. The work of each of these different committees is not necessarily deeply linked to the congregation's mission. And so what we're trying to present tonight here is an alternative way of doing justice work as Unitarian Universalists in our congregations. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Pastor Danny.
So in doing this work, one of the things that becomes the most interesting is trying on this concept of intersectionality and what that means. And, and with this curriculum, intersectionality is the complex cumulative manner in which the effects of different forms of discrimination combine, overlap, or intersect. And we see that in Kimberly Williams Crenshaw begins to talk to us about and demonstrate how the term was coined. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time here. The term was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989. She's a critical race theory and constitutional law at UCLA, and justice activists and thinkers who inhabit multiple oppressed identities have been thinking this way for a long time. So in the words of the Black feminist thinker Audre Lorde, says there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And so some of the principles for intersectional justice work in our congregations are: none of our justice communities exist in a vacuum. We understand that environmental justice is racial justice, is economic justice, is social justice, is reproductive justice, and so we get to try on this intersectional lens into congregational work. Another one is, rather than thinking about which issues is more urgent, we must move toward understanding ourselves as well as all working together on different facets of complex multi-issue problems. And so here I got an example to kind of see some of this in my work with BLM Minneapolis. I came into BLM Minneapolis in 2014. It was right when we did the first action at the Mall of America, and I was brought in as a cisgendered Black pastor, non-denominational Christian, into a group of queer and trans women and femmes in leadership. This was like a world that I had never had any experience in, knew nothing about outside of, the marriage amendment being passed, and seeing now here I was at this table. I really felt like I was kind of at a disadvantage, and rather than going in with this old paradigm of like going in and trying to assert myself as I'm the oldest person on the team, trying to bring this paradigm from church work and congregational life and that kind of stuff. And rather than, I had to subscribe to this idea of seeking first to understand rather than to be understood. So I spent a lot of time observing. I spent a lot of time learning and asking questions. I remember at the first meeting, they had we went around, did rounds of introductions, and one of the questions was, was to say your name and then tell us your gender pronoun. And now, mind you, I had never heard this phrase, gender pronoun, ever in life. I was like, I was trying to really go back and through my elementary years and define what pronoun was. And so I'm hearing people say, she, her, hers, or they, their, and it came around, I said, Danny Gibbons, I don't know what my gender pronoun is. And someone said, do you go by he, him, his? I said, yeah, I do go by that. So that's your gender pronoun. And so that began the learning process for me. And so it was maybe for about 6 or 7 months, I sat silently. I sat in community. I sat from a space of vulnerability and transparency. I wasn't afraid to ask questions. And I also sat at a place where I had to struggle with decentering my own narrative as a cisgender Black man, in this work that's being led by queer and trans women and femmes. And so this was something altogether different. So I had to pull back and really try on that. And this has been a learning process that continues to move and set with me even to this day. And it's shaped a lot of the work that I do now, is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not going to go word for word through these principles, but I think you get the idea. I want to share a couple of examples from Unitarian Universalist history of times that we've either really struggled with or really tried to work on intersectionality in our justice work. The first, I'm sure, is familiar to many of you. You'll recall that there was a big struggle after the Civil War, the last half of the 19th century, around voting rights, much as there is now, right? And at the time, one of the major contentions was, if we're going to expand enfranchisement, give more people the vote, are we going to focus on getting women the vote? And in that case, it really meant white women. Or are we going to focus on getting Black people the vote, right? Formerly enslaved people and free and newly freed people. And while those two movements for what they called universal manhood suffrage and women's suffrage worked together at the beginning, it became clear that to actually pass amendments to the Constitution that would grant the vote, they were going to have to prioritize one group, Black men or white women, over the other. Susan B. Anthony, of course, famous Unitarian, she famously said, I will cut off my arm before I fight for the Negro man to get the vote before white women. Frederick Douglass, great champion of women's rights, but ultimately ended up really struggling for Black men to get the vote before other groups, which is ultimately what ended up happening. In the middle of this slide, you'll see Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, 19th century Unitarian in Philadelphia. Please look her story up if you don't know anything about her. Author, thinker, activist, wonderful person. She found herself, of course, at the center of these two struggles, right? She was a Black woman, and she refused to choose between her Blackness or her womanness, and ultimately ended up founding an organization for Black women, kind of akin to the NAACP today, one of the forerunners of that organization, and struggling for suffrage for all people, universal suffrage. And I will say clearly that our denomination, Unitarians who were struggling for enfranchisement, almost always fell down on the side of championing white women as the first wave. And of course that didn't happen, but we really struggled at this point in our history. The second example is very recent. I'm sure some of you recognize these fine folks in the photo. We've got Reverend Sean Dennison, Reverend Teresa Soto, and Reverend Michael Tino here in the foreground. This is a photo from General Assembly this past summer. Reverend Soto presented a responsive resolution into the plenary that part of the text of which is here. One of the great ironies is that, we're always striving to do well, we're striving to do justice, and we miss the mark sometimes. Our analysis is limited, we forget things, we fall short of what we would like to be. And in this case, our national campaign, which is still currently called Standing on the Side of Love, is an incredibly ableist phrase, right? It implies that in order to be for justice, one needs to be able to physically stand. And there's a community of folks with a variety of disabilities among Unitarian Universalism and their allies who said, this is not right. I can struggle for justice, I can rise for justice, but I cannot stand for justice because of the way my body is, and my body is beautiful and valued too. And this responsive resolution came before the General Assembly, and it passed this past summer. And so the folks at the UUA are in the process right now of thinking through and getting feedback on how we will rename the Standing on the Side of Love campaign to be more inclusive of folks, because one of those principles that Danny was talking about earlier is that if your movement for justice doesn't actually include liberation and inclusion for all people, it's not going to address the root causes, those intersections of systems of domination that keep us all suppressed and marginalized.
And the one thing I'm just going to add is I learned top secret information this week that next week we're about to hear the new name of this campaign, and a lot of tremendous work was done being thoughtful and intentional and careful with a lot of things, including a lot of us already have the t-shirt that says Standing on the Side of Love, so what do we do now? It just was, everyone was really able to partner to do something better. So look in your inbox, check your newsletter and Facebook.
Absolutely. Oh, that's exciting news. So timely. Thank you, Sharon, for popping in with that.
And it is perfect for leading us into the operating definition for what we really mean when we say social justice. Social justice is a state and a society in which all people and communities have access to the resources and freedoms necessary to survive and flourish, regardless of identity and background. And so social justice work can take on many forms. Here are a few examples of some of the forms of social justice work can take on. And you might categorize these in terms of the kind of work that is about resisting what is wrong with the world, and the kind of work that is about recreating or reimagining a world that looks different from the one we know. So forms of social justice, some of the examples would be protests, rallies, and marches, community organizing, public art performance, letter writing campaigns, grassroots fundraising, education, door knocking, one-to-one meetings, and one of my favorite is creating new forms of relationship, governance, and resources sharing that challenge the systems of domination.
Great. So with that, we're going to begin taking you through this model for assessment of our congregations. How are we doing? With that definition of justice, right, it's aspirational. We are not there yet. Our congregations are not there yet. And yet our work is to try and create a world in which that kind of flourishing possibility and freedom is in fact accessible to all people. So we're going to take you through this framework, and you should have all received a PDF of the framework that we're going to be walking you through that includes a number of concrete examples of how these praxis areas can actually show up in our congregations. We're going to take questions on the framework and definitions and really dig into it deeply after you've had a chance to read it over and process it and actually do some assessment of your own congregations in the month between this webinar and the next part 2 of this webinar. But want to let you know that this is the model that we're going to share with you tonight is really rooted in the concept of praxis. Praxis is the cycle of reflection, action, and theory, right? The idea that we learn, we change the world not by just learning or just acting, but that those have to be in a constant loop. We need to practice. We need to think about what's happened as we have practiced. We need to learn new concepts and try and integrate them, and then we try and act again, and we continue that cycle. Excuse me. So the concept in this model is that social justice work doesn't just live with one committee or a couple of committees that do work on different issues, but that actually a real deeply embodied commitment to justice in our congregations is something that we practice in all areas of congregational life by every leader, by every participant in the community. And so this concept of 9 praxis areas, places where we're learning, reflecting, and acting over and over again, it's our attempt to try and describe the idea that our justice work doesn't happen somewhere off to the side as an ancillary function of the congregation, but that it lives in the DNA, in the bones of the congregation. So we're going to hop right in and talk to you about these kind of 9 praxis areas. And each of them, we're going to provide a definition, and then Danny and I are going to tell you some stories about how we've seen these show up either in congregational life or in our secular organizing.
So public witness and prophetic voice. The congregation regularly, boldly, and accountably uses its institutional capital to publicly proclaim its yearning for justice and equity as a natural outgrowth of its religious values.
Shout out to our folks at Elliott Universalist Unitarian Chapel, in Missouri, right outside of Ferguson. This is one of our congregations that has held Black Lives Matter vigils every single week since Michael Brown was killed, and this is a photo of one of their vigils.
That's what's up. Shout out to them. And it fits. That image fits perfectly into the story of when BLM Minneapolis, when we occupied the 4th precinct, and following the wake of the death of Jamar Clark, an unarmed Black man that was murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department. And so during the 18-day occupation of the 4th precinct, my role as the clergy liaison with Black Lives Matter Minneapolis was to organize clergy that had a real response to the issue that was at hand. And so we had folks coming from all over Minnesota and even outside of the state that were coming in and wanting to plug in and do work. And so getting all of these folks together that come with different mindsets, governances, theologies, approaches, ways of engagement that have, different styles of being present and all of that. So my job was to bring those folks together and to begin to decenter an agenda-based narrative at the 4th precinct, which sometimes what I saw a lot of during that time, there was a pretty large organization that had came in and had a lot of social capital, has a lot of white social capital and white privilege, had put a lot of people of color on the front lines to engage communities of color, but the narrative behind the scenes was agenda-based to move forward, kind of a white privilege, systemic, agenda. And so they came in and tried to assert themselves, and I had to do some work with them respectfully and lovingly to decenter that narrative and show that we're here to center the voices of the impacted communities, the marginalized groups and identity persons that were present there, and not to come with our own institutional flair, swagger, or prowess. Everybody wanted to do their own thing, and I saw a lot of that. And so rather than just kind of shutting folks down, I was like, okay, so what? We started doing asset mapping and started being able to find out where folks could show up with real resources. So for example, there were a number of congregations that could send volunteers out that could work shifts, 4-hour shifts that would kind of like provide spiritual care or respond to the needs of people that were present and showing up, coming and going during the 4th precinct occupation. There were folks that was coordinating and organizing the supplies that were being brought in, sometimes hourly, but definitely were coming out daily. We had folks that had vans that could begin to escort our people who may not have been able to get there. We had, there was a lot of different things that kind of happened there that showed to it. The marshaling that organizations showed up to protect us along when we were shutting down highways and marching down streets that didn't have police escorts. And so those were a number of some of the things that we did during that time that I saw just become revolutionary. And in doing that, it created community because you had folks who were traditional Black Baptists at the table with, Universalists and Unitarians or UCC folks. And so you had these kind of dialogues that were happening and being created as a result of us coming together around this public witness.
Yeah, and I think, Danny, one thing I would just highlight from that is that, most of us are used to showing up with our congregations being like, here's what we can do, here's what we want to see, here are the conditions under which we'll support you. And what you're describing is like you said, the decentering of this agenda-based narrative, right? This idea that, actually, if we're going to be of use, it's not just about us standing by ourselves, rising by ourselves. I'm correcting my own ableist language here. But it's about saying, how can we be of use? And then being willing to make ourselves uncomfortable and do some of the work that's not always quite so sexy, but to be out there, to leverage the capital that we do have to make those voices heard.
And then we move into service and solidarity, which is the congregation offers material, human, and infrastructural support and service to resource movements for social justice, allowing frontline communities to strategically channel their energy and resources into leadership. Uh, I call this particular slide ally installation. And what ally installation is this concept of putting white activists and faith leaders around Black activists or activists of colors, or those who are representatives of the impacted or marginalized communities. Again, during the BLM Minneapolis work that we were doing, we met weekly at the least, regularly for probably 2 years straight. And so there were a group of UUs from a couple different congregations throughout the Twin Cities that had organized folks that would come together and basically be like Meals on Wheels for us. And so they came and they gathered data about what our specific dietary needs were, those kind of things. And then they showed up. They prepared the meals, they served them, they then cleared away the meals and that kind of stuff. So there wasn't no burden on us, that we could focus solely on the work. And I mean, they did this, raised their own money to provide the food that we were eating. I mean, it was such an awesome and an amazing thing, because a part of that, it created more of an allyship, because then I was able to meet different people. The other activists were able to meet folks that were doing this work that necessarily we probably wouldn't have been able to interface, in being overwhelmed by the enormity of the work. So that worked out so amazing during our activist time with BLM.
Yeah. What I loved about that, and I brought tacos one night to the BLM folks. They were good. But what I loved about that is that what it did is it capitalized on the instinct in a lot of our congregations around service work, right? We do great things. We do clothes drives. We do, we make sandwiches for the homeless shelter. We open up our kitchen. But what it does is it channels that into not just direct service, but into strategically supporting movements and movement leaders. So, y'all are working 3 jobs, doing this on the side, not sleeping, trying to hold down an occupation. And, you don't need to be worried about where the meal at meeting, right? And so using that instinct that churches have, they already got the practice, right? You don't have to teach them how to make a meal, but they're ready to show up and leverage that power in a different way. The other example I'm thinking of is, like, Danny, you are here on this call tonight because of this kind of solidarity work that our congregations are doing. As I mentioned earlier on here, we got a generous grant from the UU Service Committee, the USC, and then the Twin Cities congregations, 4 of our large congregations here in the Twin Cities, offered to match that grant in order to bring Danny in as an organizer. And in fact, it was before Danny was even on the scene, so to help us get an organizer. I made a commitment to doing my best to find a talented organizer of color, somebody from another marginalized group, so that we would have leadership other than just me as a white queer woman. And by doing strategic fundraising in their congregations, we now have this incredibly talented person in Danny Givens, who brings not only his skills to Moose Jaw, but also his relationships, his deep grounding in the community, right? And so in a way, this is not just even about service, but it's about making Unitarian Universalism in the Twin Cities, making Unitarian Universalists in the Twin Cities and across Minnesota more powerful, better resourced, and not playing this game of like, we're each going to do our own thing, right? So these congregations, came together and said, we are committed to doing this as Unitarian Universalists, and we're going to not let the money stop us. I'll finish this little piece by saying, I think sometimes you use they don't think fundraising is so glamorous. It's something we'd prefer not to do, right? Like, people don't like to talk about money. We like to maybe like give a plate away every once in a while, or maybe even every week. But imagine what would happen if in every single one of our congregations, for example, I'm working with a group here in the Twin Cities. We've got an interfaith coalition. If every single progressive, liberal, religious person in the Twin Cities put $1 in the offering plate every weekend, we'd have between $20,000 and $40,000 a week of unrestricted funds coming in the door. We could use those funds to support organizers who are facing housing insecurity, help pay them for their work, create bail funds when people need to be bailed out of jail, bring trainers and organizers to our communities to help our folks get better money. But like, money makes a difference. And if we get creative and if we work together, we can get big money that can change big things. And it lives then outside of the nonprofit industrial complex. It lives outside of grants and foundations that are really restrictive in who they give money to and how. But we got the power, y'all. Service and solidarity.
Then we move into interfaith and inter-organizational partnership, which is the congregation cultivates cultural and spiritual humility, develops deep and mutually fulfilling partnerships with other faith communities, organizations, and coalitions. During my role, more of an active role with Black Lives Matter Minneapolis, an outpouring of the occupation created a response from clergy, again, across the state. And it also created a response from some of the local clergy, more specifically, the clergy of color that were millennial clergy at the particular time. And so I was blessed to be able to put together this group of folks called BCUC, which stands for Black Clergy United for Change. And it was a group of, again, young millennial clergy who believed in the power of social justice and transformation in the urban communities and abroad. And it was through that work that we began to house and do all of the kind of clergy related or faith related work to the movement. That we came out and we ended up issuing an apology letter on behalf of the Black church to the queer community. We issued an apology letter to the millennials, and we issued an apology letter to cisgender Black millennial men as well, which created this crazy uproar where a lot of the older, traditional, staple Black churches had a real problem. I mean, here it is. It's a group of young Black clergy saying, hey, we're good with the queer and with the queer community, with the trans community. We're good with the femme community. We apologize for our narratives that excluded them and set them on the outside. The paper published it, got behind it. And then we got the attention from that of this group of ministers that are the senior ministers of what they call the downtown churches in the Twin City or in Minneapolis. And so these would be those big churches that have those multi-million-dollar budgets that just, have, $20,000 just in the book club budget, that kind of stuff. And so those folks came to meet with us, and with them brought their relationships. So with them came an imam from the Muslim community, came a rabbi from the Jewish community, came Episcopalian minister, Presbyterian. I mean, it was some of everybody that was represented. And from that partnership, we were able to now begin to do some of the asset mapping. So for example, during one of the protests following the non-indictment of the officers who killed Jamar Clark, there was a large action that was to be hosted immediately following the verdict. We didn't know what was going to happen or what was going to become of it. There was this really big church with an amazing budget that decided that they would, one, become the phone bank for those activists and organizers or those who were participating in it, to be able to call if they were arrested and had needed bail fund or jail support and that kind of thing. And it was also like this central hub that if you could get to, you would find safety. We had a lot of the large congregations that were opening their pulpits to myself and other faith-based organizers to come in and talk about our tactics and strategies and the narratives, why we shut down the highway, why many of your members were inconvenienced the night before for hours on 94. And it created this intersectional dialogue where folks were able to say, wow, okay, I understand it. It didn't just paint us with the narrative that the media shared. There was an offering of space where organizers during this time were able to access any of the particular congregations or organizations that had space for us to meet, because we couldn't meet in the same space over and over again. Sometimes things would be infiltrated. We had folks that were onto us. So we needed to privatize some of that. And there were congregation organizations that offered that. And the final piece was around the leveraging of power. These big congregations brought with them a whole lot of power. So from that particular partnership, I was given an opportunity on behalf of BLM to present to the Minnesota Rabbis Association, which became something greater. I had begun to do work with the Catholic churches. So this interfaith and inter-organizational partnership is still alive and well today. And it's one that we're beginning to see replicated in larger cities across the United States. It's been some amazing work, to say the least.
Yeah. And Danny, I just want to add on to that a little bit, which is that, I met for the first time, I was still new in town, right? During the 4th Precinct occupation, November 2015. But the other clergy folks, right? We were being called on to show up in our collars, to be there, to do some of this flanking you're talking about. Some of the folks that I met in that space are now some of not only my closest colleagues, but also my dearest friends. They're the people who provide me with spiritual support. I know the same is true for lay people who participated in actions together, who got to know each other. And at that time, what your organizing did, what our organizing did, is it began to weave this fabric of relationship that then we've been able to access over and over again, right? And so the interfaith community here in the Twin Cities is so much stronger than it was 3 years ago, right? And so when the next thing happens, which it will, because we live in that kind of world, there's this group of people who are ready to go, right? And it includes folks of all kinds of different traditions who've been through things together and who have trust with each other, right? Who know that we are showing up together and it makes a difference.
And trust is important when you start talking about relationship building in this work. And the real gold in this work is in relationships. As a Christian, the book that I subscribe to has a particular passage that says, where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. And so hearts were broken open during our actions and protests and resisting the narratives of the status quo. And it created this space and place, because if you don't have relationship with folks, they're not going to be as likely to want to go in their pocketbook to assist you. But it was those real, genuine, and authentic relationships that were created during that time that set the stage for financial partnership and fundraising, which is our next slide. And financial partnership and fundraising, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You like that transition right there? That's good.
There it is. I love it with the little curtains. Financial partnership and fundraising is the congregation is self-aware about its financial resources and networks and is willing to leverage this power to channel money into movement building beyond the congregation. So out of this work, Lena Catherine Gardner, who some of you may know, she is the executive director of Black Lives of Unitarian Universalists. She's a friend and a colleague of mine who brought me into the activism work with Black Lives Matter Minneapolis. So here at Unity Church, Lena had approached me one day and was like, we're approaching the UUA about accessing some funds to support the work of, Black Lives and the Unitarian Universalist Association. And we need someone, an organization that we can trust, or an institution that we can trust that will be willing to hold the money, because we don't have a 501c3. We're not a part of the nonprofit industrial complex. And my relationship with Unity Church at the time was one that and it still was gold. And because of the level of leaning into the tensions and the issues that we were facing collectively as institutions and individually as institutions. So I walked into Rob Eller Isaacs, who is one of the co-ministers at Unity Church Unitarian in St. Paul. I walked into his office and I said, Lena is approaching the UUA about, accessing some funds to be able to do this work. Would Unity Church Unitarian be willing to hold this money and offer their 501c3 as a covering for this money? And Rob said, sure, yeah. And immediately began to go to bat at the UUA board level. I mean, Rob Eller Isaacs, in all transparency with us, was very sensitive and considerate to the time that we were in and how much of the narrative needed to be shifted and how he could use his privilege and his position to move it forward, not knowing what we were doing, but willing to find a way, which became so powerful. I mean, friendships potentially were challenged. I can tell you that it wasn't necessarily an easy process, but it was one that continues to prove itself to be fruitful, to say the least. And I'm grateful to have been a witness to that. That's just been kind of amazing, to say the least.
Yeah, and Danny, when you and I were talking about this story earlier, and so many other stories, what I love about this is that Unity Church began by saying, how can we say yes rather than why should we say no? Right? There's this fledgling organization that's coming up This can happen in any of our communities, right? There's a local justice organization that's trying to get its bearings. You may or may not actually have complete political agreement with them. You may or may not know them all and trust them, but they come to you and say, look, we know you're the game in town that is the most likely to support our work. Can you raise some money for us? Can you help be our fiscal sponsors and help with your 501c3? Will you do a special offering? Can we use your space, right? And instead of immediately going to like, well, what's our liability? What does our insurance policy say? How would this work? How many congregational votes do we have about it? We start with like, okay, how can we say yes to this posture of yes? And I love that story for that reason.
Yeah.
So another thing, I mentioned this kind of at the beginning of the hour, but this idea that we're doing consistent theological reflection about our justice work. The congregation sees social justice work as a natural expression of their tradition's values and beliefs, and are able to evaluate issues and actions through the lens of their faith. There's a wonderful living example of this right now here in the Twin Cities. A few years ago, when a lot of the Black Lives Matter stuff was happening, during the Standing Rock occupation, First Universalist Church of Minneapolis began seeing a lot of their members wanting to participate, especially in things like direct action, right? Civil disobedience, arrestable actions to interrupt business as usual. And people were wanting to participate, but they didn't have the training, and they were really feeling reticent about showing up alone for those kinds of actions, which are, risky. And so my colleague, Justin Schroeder, the Reverend Justin Schroeder, one of the senior ministers there, along with the other leadership, both lay and clergy there, came up with this idea that we're going to do this stuff together. We're going to go do a direct action or go to a protest or, do a project together. But we're always going to encompass it, surround it with theological reflection. So let's say we're going to go do a protest or a direct action. We're going to meet together at the church. We're going to spend half an hour, 45 minutes thinking about, why are we doing this as a church? How does this align with our values? What does Unitarian Universalism have in terms of wisdom and courage and resource for us to empower us as we go into this work together? 30, 45 minutes, folks would talk, they'd get to know each other, they'd build a little trust, and then they would go together, literally carpool. They'd do the thing, and then they'd come back to the church afterward and do, 30 minutes of debrief. How did that feel? How are you feeling now? What are you going to be reflecting on? What would you like to do differently next time? How are we going to support each other with whatever feelings and emotions we have? Let's pray, let's sing, let's do the stuff. Over time, that has migrated and actually now become a thing that they're working on. They're working on, and they've hired us to create theological reflection curricula that go with all of their service work, all of their justice partnerships in the congregation. So if you're going to participate in the Habitat for Humanity Build Week, if you're going to be a part of the rotating shelter for folks who are experiencing homelessness, before you volunteer, you're going to go to an orientation that involves some reflection about, what do our UU values say about homelessness? What is our tradition's experience with working with homeless populations? How might I bring my own story of being housed or not throughout my life, my stories of housing insecurity or security, into this work? How can I connect deeply with this? How do I understand homelessness as it's related to other systems of domination and oppression? So it's really rooting folks in that reflection first. Then they go and do the thing. They build the house. They, serve the meals. They stay overnight. And then throughout the course of whatever the project is, they're also having little moments to come back and talk. Maybe it's at a lunch gathering. Maybe it's, at the end of the evening shift, folks are talking to each other. And then there's a debrief at the end. And this is going with every single piece of justice work that's happening in the congregation. And it's creating incredible meaning and also deep relationship with the folks who are doing the work.
Then we get into spiritual care and formation for activists. Spiritual care and formation for activists is the congregation prioritizes nurturing the spiritual and emotional health of its justice leaders and equipping them with the competencies to be faithful and effective leaders. So in 2015, No, I'm sorry, 2000, was that? Yeah, it was 15, 2015.
Orlando is 16. Summer of 16.
Yeah. So many have happened. It's kind of a blur, unfortunately. But it's summer of 2015, in July to be exact.
2016.
Philando Castile was murdered by Officer Geronimo Yanez in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. And as a result of that particular injustice, activists then took to the streets in St. Paul and occupied the governor's mansion where he lives, which is roughly about a little over a half a mile away from Unity Church Unitarian. Unity Church Unitarian opened its doors during that governor's occupation and opened its doors to activists 24/7 throughout every day of the night and week. And there was someone who would respond, that was on call, whether it was a janitor, so forth and so on. So activists could come here, and even not activists, but also lay folks come here and just have a time for reprieve, refresh, get a little something to eat, have some coffee, maybe have some time to be in community with one another, because we were all in kind of this height of like trauma and all of this stuff that was happening. On the last particular night of the governor's mansion occupation, I had went home from the actual occupation, and I was staying in Unity's parsonage, which is next door to Unity Church's church. And so I was the person for that night that was to open up the church, make sure everybody was okay and all that good stuff. And this particular night I opened the church and I was kind of tired, and I went back in and just laid down. I woke up and happened to log on to Facebook and saw Facebook Live of the police coming in and ending the occupation. Facebook Live showed activists running in the night, 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, running through the night trying to find, sanctuary or refuge. And I heard one of the particular persons yell out, "Get to the church, get to Unity Church. That's where it's safe. That's where it's safe. Let's run to the church." And as a person who is pursuing fellowship with the UUA and all of that good stuff, it brought joy to my heart to hear folks hear people of color, hear impacted communities saying, without, like, it was innately, let's go to the church, let's run there, that's where safety is. That's what it was. And then on the flip side, you had clergy who were doing this work who didn't necessarily have the wherewithal to gauge the impact of this work. So I talked to you guys a little earlier about Black Clergy United for Change, which was a group of millennial pastors that I organized together to come together and respond to the issues that were impacting our community. And so these were folks who had years of kind of church worker service, but no experience in activism or organizing, from a social transformation or social justice standpoint. And so came very eager, very zealous, a lot of passion, wanting to run into everything and not knowing how to really temper, oneself for the work. And burnout happened very fast. Compassion fatigue set in really quick. And it was one of those things where I had to take the time out to begin to talk to them about the ABCs of self-care. And just a simple, quick run through of it is the A stands for awareness. In doing activist or organizing work or any work that's addressing the issues of impacted communities, you got to be aware of who you are, where you are, what your body's speaking to you, what energy is around you, what you're offering yourself up to you to, and in that awareness, you develop what the B stands for is balance, about how in that awareness of, for example, realizing like I may have about 4 hours a day to give to this kind of work, whether that's 2 hours on social media and actually 2 hours in direct conversation with somebody, or an hour during the action and another, 2 hours in a group gathering about it. But balancing that out, knowing that I don't have to be at every action. I don't have to retweet or share or repost everything that someone puts up about the particular issue at hand. Having balance as a person, that balance invites you into the C of this, and that's connection. That connection keeps us from finding ourselves alone or siloed in this work. And this is what this particular webinar was about, breaking down the silos. That connection of seeing the interconnectedness of all of us in this helps you to take better care of yourself in this work.
Yeah. And I think, Danny, I love that story about how congregations can be a part of providing solace and spiritual care for activists in the community. The lessons that you learned from organizing with BCUC. I also want to just emphasize that, like, we already have activists within our congregations, right? We've got, folks, if you think of our congregations as sort of like a bell curve where the majority of people are sort of at a certain place in the middle around their politics, their action, whatever. You've always got the folks who are on the more radical end, and you'll have the folks who are more resistant to the justice work. And there are fewer of each of those. But we have to be able to minister to the activists in our congregation, the folks who are leading the committees, who are out there trying to mobilize folks in their congregations, who are, out in their jobs doing justice work all the time, who are in deep relationship with movements. That burnout happens much more quickly for those folks, right? And we need to be able to do specialized spiritual care for those people. We also need to be able to minister to resistance, right? We need to give tools, development to the folks who are not on board yet, the ones who say, we need less preaching about justice from the pulpit. And I don't mean to diminish that, right? Like, we come to church to have our spiritual needs met, and we find that, all of this stuff from the outside is coming in, and it's hard for us. And so we need to also be able to care for those folks so that the congregation as a whole doesn't get hijacked by the few people who are really anti-justice work, or at least not anti-justice, but they want their church to feel more like a refuge than a platform. So we're going to move on to one of our next areas here, which is study and political education. This one we love as Unitarian Universalists, right? We love a book forum. We love a movie screening or a training or a conversation circle. And it's really important. It's great that we love those things. This is that, every year we do a common read on a book. And so, many of us have read, The Death of Jocelyn or Between the World and Me or, any of a number of things. And that study together gives us common vocabulary. It gives us common language. Danny and I, in our relationship, have been talking recently about Adrienne Maree Brown's book, Emergent Strategy, and it's deeply influencing the conversations that we're having together because we're studying the same stuff, right? This is the part of the praxis cycle that's about learning and education and theory. What matters is that this goes along with action, right? And also that spiritual reflection. So the congregation offers regular opportunities for members to learn about justice issues, gain concrete skills, and develop political analysis. I think we get that one, so I'm going to move pretty quickly on from that. This is one of the most slippery ones among these praxis areas, and we call it institutional transformation. The congregation engages in critical self-assessment and seeks outside consultation to ensure that power structures and practices align with stated justice values and make space for diverse leadership and participation. So, I'm thinking actually about our national movement over the last year and the ways in which we have been forced to and also allowed ourselves to be transformed by the current moment, right? So I'm thinking of, for example, after Reverend Peter Morales resigned last spring, the appointment of the 3 co-moderators co-presidents of the Unitarian Universalist Association. That we had never seen that before, right? They were folks of color. They represented various different identities and experiences. There's a lay person involved, a queer Black woman, a disabled person, any number of things that we had never seen in leadership. And the structure was different, right? The 3 folks. We also had, if you were at General Assembly this last year or have seen some of the videos, we had, following the wake of Jim Key, our moderator's death last year, we had 3 co-moderators of our General Assembly. And Greg and Alandria and Kathy just did this amazing job of interrupting business as usual, right? They would often stop in the middle of a plenary discussion and say, you know what? Robert's Rules, it's racist. It's got some bad stuff in it. It is not set up to privilege the voices of the marginalized. So we're going to interrupt doing things the way that we have always done, and we're going to find a way around the rules, right? We're going to do this to really live out our justice commitments rather than being trapped by the structures that we've chosen. This can happen at all levels. I'm thinking of congregations that have an explicit commitment to racial justice or environmental justice, social justice in their mission statement or in their ends if they're in policy governance. I think there's a lot of different stuff. And actually, Danny, I know that you're in the middle of a conversation about ends with your congregation and unity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're now beginning to draft the means and the ends for the next 5 years. And so I pastor a Christian church. It's non-denominational. The name of the church is above every name. We came to Unity Church Unitarian as about 4 years ago as tenants to rent. And the rental agreement kind of got thrown out of the window maybe about 7 months into the rental agreement. But that came as a result of us maybe 6 weeks after I came on, after our church was there, that we began to do beloved conversations to begin to try on and address some of the, dialogues and reflections and meditations around racism and oppression that exists within our congregations. And so now here we are 4 years later. I've had a 3-year residency that Unity offered me, and it was a time of discernment. We now had drafted a covenant between the two churches of how we will live and be together in the world. And in drafting the means and the ends for the year, my congregation, who doesn't have a traditional board or governance structure like so many of our congregations in the UU landscape have, my congregation is, parishioners here, we do what we do. It's our decision-making process is, you like it, we're doing it. That kind of thing, whereas it's not so much as the congregational vote. And so now being at the table where we're imagining and reimagining a world in a congregation where the two communities aren't just kind of having this transactional pass between these two services that happen, but where we're actually leaning into this, where we're actually really doing the work. And I love it because my congregation is probably about 15 people. Unity has 1,500. So you can kind of see the numbers and how that looks, but my congregation is being seen as an institution that is viable, that is healthy, that is, impacting change in our community, just like any other institution. And it's been great to be a part of that.
Yeah. And this one is so slippery because what it means is throwing out the rule book, right? Like nobody knows what this looks like or feels like, but we don't let our tradition, our polity, our experience, our fear get in the way of, again, that posture of yes, that leaning into what might be if we're willing to abandon business as usual and do things differently. Mm-hmm. So our last area here is one that many of us have thought about in terms of justice. And it's worship, ritual, and celebration. Lots of us have talked about how to create more justice-oriented, more multicultural, more anti-oppressive worship in lots of ways. And of course, that happens on Sunday mornings or Saturday afternoons when we have our services. But, I'm thinking of also the importance of like ritual, for example. This, our tradition has struggled mightily to get rid of harmful concepts of sin and evil. But one thing that has left us lacking is rituals of confession, of atonement and forgiveness. And that kind of thing is incredibly important when we're doing social justice work. And so we need to be creating new ones. We need to be offering people a space to engage in that kind of work together. And then we got to celebrate, right? I mean, this is a hugely important piece. And Danny, actually, we were talking earlier. Do you want to talk about your experience with the marriage amendment, which so many people of faith here in Minnesota were involved in?
So the marriage amendment, I wasn't as, I guess I could say, as woke as I am now in the work. And so I seen the marriage amendment take place and be passed as a cisgendered Black man who was a Christian who didn't necessarily have as much as a purview for it, or even a narrative for that matter. But one of the things that I saw in the kind of imagery of it all was prior to the marriage amendment, a lot of the imagery, at least on social media or any forms of the of media that's out there, is a lot of the imagery was around kind of like the painstaking struggles of queer, trans, and femme communities about getting to this place of having their narrative centered and being seen as a part of this cultural landscape that we have here in the United States. And so it was but when the marriage amendment happened and took place, all of a sudden my timeline, CNN, and every other form of media was flooded with a barrage of joyful, celebratory, humanizing,
happy people,
images of folks who had not only fought for it, but it was like, lifelong dream. And I didn't say this then, Ashley, but it was really much like the imagery of the Black community after Obama was elected. That kind of like, you're seeing, Black folks really being cast in that thing. It was this celebratory thing where it was, a community who didn't possibly think it would ever happen. But it humanized the story for me. And it helped me to be able to celebrate with them.
Right. And, so finally you have an image for people like me, queer people, we're not living miserable lives. It's not only oppression and heartbreak, right? And I have an image of you and your community as people who are fierce and joyful and, celebrating and resisting. And I think, let's talk intersectionality, right? Like the queer community and the Black community have a lot of self-interest, right? I mean, like our folks are targeted by the same systems. And so when we win, which doesn't happen as often as we want to, we got to claim that victory and we got to celebrate. And our churches are a part of that. Our congregations have to be places where people get hope, where we feel more connected, where we're able to lift up those narratives of beauty and joy. And in doing so, we humanize each other, we connect with folks that we share common interest with, and we get sustenance for the journey.
Can I add here?
Please.
So BLM as a movement doesn't necessarily have, rituals or, worship and things like that. And so, we experienced some wins, but not a lot of wins. And one of the things that became a national ritual and a form of celebration, I guess you could say, as worship, is that there were certain chapters across the states that started doing Black Joy Sunday.
Yes.
And Black Joy Sunday is essentially people of color coming together, whether it's in some type of open park, field, or somewhere where we can just be in community with one another. We're dancing, we're doing face painting, we're playing spades, dominoes, whatever that was. And this is something that happened in some cities once a month, in some cities every Sunday. But it was something to say, we're going to celebrate regardless. And it's a ritual that still goes on. There's one of the largest ones is out in DC right now, but I was reminded of that in talking about this.
Right. That's right. Absolutely. So, friends, we've taken you, I know we are at 10 minutes now, or even less than that, 8 minutes perhaps. We've taken you through these 9 praxis areas. I'm sure there are a number of questions, but you have kind of the handout that we've given you that frames these. It's got all these definitions on it. It also has real concrete examples of how congregations can live these out. Sharon, do you have something to add here as we wrap up? You're still muted.
Thank you, Ashley. So I popped up because someone did type something in the chat box, which I thought was a really good question. This was, what do you recommend for an adult curriculum about historical roots of our traditions, history with social justice work?
I am not the curriculum expert. I know there are some good ones in the Tapestry of Faith curriculum. And actually, maybe Sharon, you've got the names on the tip of your tongue that I don't.
I don't, but I'm going to put the link in the chat box. One is like River of Faith, and I can't remember the other one, but those are the ones I thought of.
Yeah.
I cannot say I've done them personally. I can say they've been done by people who I think do real quality work. So I would hope that would work, and I'm going to just stick them in the box right now.
Yeah, and if you are on this webinar and you have experience with a social justice curriculum that particularly focuses on our denomination's history in terms of justice, please feel free and pipe up, because I'm sure there are some great ones out there. So now is the point where we could maybe take, you know what, we probably don't even have time to really even get into a question. So I'm just going to wrap us up with grace here. and be mean teacher and give you all some homework. So you should have all received a PDF of this rubric with these 9 praxis areas. There's a page for each area. There's a couple of reflection questions at the end of each page to help you kind of think about where your congregation is in that praxis area. There's also some information at the end about sort of characteristics of deeply rooted justice work in congregations and some best practices that I think will be helpful for you. Excuse me. What we would like for you to do is to actually, hopefully with your buddies at your church fellowship or society, we'd like you to actually audit your congregation. Think about your congregation's life, get together with some folks, talk through it. How are we doing these or not doing the things in this praxis area? I want to be clear that the examples that we have are just some of many, many, many things that could be included. They're just highlights. Do not expect that your congregation is going to be stellar in all areas, but you might learn about, well, we're really strong in study and education, but we're really lacking on financial partnership and fundraising. We hope that doing this audit is going to give you a sense of sort of areas where you might improve and how you might systematize that commitment to justice in your congregation. This is a 2-part webinar, right? So in the next iteration of this, we are going to be taking your feedback to figure out how to manage this conversation, how to have meaningful dialogue, and how to hear about what's happening in your congregation. So we have 2 questions for you. We do not need responses to those questions on each page of your rubric. We don't need all of that. What we would like from you, though, is for you to email Pastor Danny and me. I put your email in the slide, Danny, so Danny's in charge of collating responses. We have 2 questions for you. The first is, after doing this audit, going through this rubric, what general observations do you have about your congregation's social justice work? What are you noticing? What are areas of strength? What's curious to you? What is clear to you after really looking at all of these areas? The second question is, what are the biggest barriers that exist within your congregation to embodying these kind of best practices that we're recommending for social justice? What's keeping you from really living it out? Whether it's something like, well, we have to take a congregational vote on every single thing that happens and it keeps us from being nimble, or we're really struggling in terms of our finances. We don't have enough to bring in guest preachers or pay our staff well, or whatever, and we can't imagine having the kind of money that you're talking about in order to really be in deep partnership. It can be really, really anything, but what is keeping you back? So if you would be so kind as to do some of this work together and then to send me and Danny some feedback in response to those 2 questions, we will then take your answers and we will let them shape our next webinar, which is happening in February. Again, Pastor Danny's email is moosja, muusja.organizer@gmail.com. It's at the bottom of your screen here. It will also be in the slides that you receive. Sharon can put it in the chat box. And part 2 of this webinar is happening in February, Tuesday, February 13th, again at the same time, so 7:45 Eastern, 6:45 Central, 5:45 Mountain, the time zones that our wonderful Mid-America region spans. And we hope that you'll join us again for that. And for the rest of our webinars, you can sign up for them on the Mid-America website. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Sharon. Nope, still muted.
Oh, I was trying to get Danny's email and I didn't get it in time. Danny, can you just say your email again so people know how to get those questions or thoughts to you? Oh, he's going to put it in the chat box. I hear him typing. I like that.
I'll put it back up on the screen too.
So folks, I hope you heard them say that if you just take a little bit of time to talk to yourself, your input is going to influence the next webinar, which is a great way for you to learn and to hold up your questions and issues and share the reality of the challenges you have in a congregation. I mean, I loved the 9 things they just suggested and the many kind of threads that those have, but I served as a parish minister for almost 20 years. And I can tell you, at times, the congregations I was in were like, it doesn't feel safe to open our doors, you know? So I would aspire to live all those things they've said, but I also know what it was like to be in a congregation where they didn't have that sense of abundance all the time. So I hope you will give them feedback, because it's going to help you, help us, help you, etc. And any final words, Ashley or Danny? And thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation.
Danny, you got a last word for us?
Yeah. I just thank you. I just want to first of all just say thank you to Mid-America Region for, you know, hosting this and putting this on and seeing this as a real need and a value, and choosing Musha as, you know, the organization to do it, because we are the best at it. And for all of those that are participating and listening, I'm just so excited to see how this rubric, to see how all of this content that we're sharing, that we begin to wrestle and grow and move around and embody in our own ways. And so I just look forward to all of the times that we will have together.
Thank you. And we hope you come back the next webinar, Ashley, again.
Thanks to my dear colleague and friend, Pastor Danny, and also to Reverend Sharon at Mid-America.
And Ashley, please remind us of when the next one is. It's February. Oh, my phone froze. Sorry, I froze there for a minute. Ashley, can you remind us of when the next webinar is? It is February.
We seem to have lost Sharon right here at the very, yes, our next webinar is Tuesday, February 13th, 7:45 Eastern, 6:45 Central, 5:45 Mountain. We look forward to seeing you there. Register for the rest of the webinars on the Mid-America website.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.